Husband sides with mother over wife. Part 1. Clara ran a finger along the edge of the photo frame, a wedding picture of her and Brian on a sunny spring day. Her smile was radiant, her hand in his, as they stood beneath an arch of wildflowers. She remembered how full of hope she'd been on that day, certain they were building a partnership that would last a lifetime. But now, 3 years into their marriage, Clara sat in their quiet living room, feeling more like an outsider in her own life than the confident woman in the photo. Brian's mother, Elaine, had been a looming presence in their relationship from the start. Clara had initially admired their closeness. Brian spoke of Elaine with warmth, describing how she had raised him on her own after his father passed. Clara had been eager to be part of that bond, imagining Sunday dinners and holidays filled with laughter and love. The reality was much different. Elaine wielded her role as Brian's mother like a weapon, masking her controlling tendencies as concern. From the beginning, she made passive-aggressive comments about Clara's choices. "Oh, Clara, you're working late again? Poor Brian, you must be so lonely without a home-cooked meal," Elaine had said on more than one occasion. Brian, who had always brushed off his mother's meddling, would laugh it off. "Mom's just old school," he'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." At first, Clara tried to keep the peace. She'd smile through Elaine's thinly veiled criticisms and take her side dishes to family dinners, hoping to be accepted. But no matter what Clara did, Elaine found fault. "She's very modern, isn't she?" Elaine had once said to Brian during a holiday dinner, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Career-focused women are so independent. I just hope she doesn't forget what's important: family." Brian's response had been a shrug and a quick subject change, leaving Clara to stew in silence. The tension reached new heights during Elaine's birthday party. Clara had spent weeks planning the celebration, going above and beyond to organize Elaine's favorite meal, decorate the backyard, and even order a custom cake. But as soon as Elaine arrived, she looked around and said, "Oh, Brian, you've outdone yourself. This is just lovely." Clara froze. She waited for Brian to correct her, to say it had been Clara's effort, not his. But Brian just smiled, basking in his mother's praise. That night, as Clara cleaned up the dishes, Elaine sauntered into the kitchen. "You know, dear," she said, her voice syrupy, "Brian deserves a lot of credit. He's always been such a thoughtful son. You're lucky to have him." Clara bit her tongue, but the sting of Elaine's words lingered. At home, Brian's loyalty to his mother became an unavoidable wedge between them. Clara found herself shrinking, questioning her own worth. Was she being too sensitive? Was Elaine right? But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't the problem. Elaine's control over Brian was. It started subtly, as these things often do. Clara noticed Brian growing more irritable when she vented about Elaine's comments. "Do you have to make everything a fight?" Brian snapped one evening after Clara recounted another of Elaine's cutting remarks. "I'm not fighting, Brian," Clara said, her voice calm but strained. "I'm trying to talk to you about how she makes me feel." "She's my mom," Brian said sharply. "She just wants what's best for us." The words stung more than Clara expected. "Us?" she asked. "It feels like she's only looking out for you." Brian shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. Elaine, emboldened by Brian's unwavering support, began to escalate her interference. When Clara suggested a vacation to celebrate their anniversary, Elaine immediately found a reason to object. "Brian, don't you think it's irresponsible to spend money on a trip when the house still needs work? Clara might not think about these things, but you have to." To Clara's dismay, Brian agreed. "Mom's right. We should probably focus on practical stuff first." It wasn't just the trip. Elaine started questioning Clara's financial contributions, implying she wasn't pulling her weight. "Doesn't Clara make less than you?" Elaine asked Brian one afternoon. "You shouldn't have to carry the entire load." Clara only discovered this conversation when Brian brought it up during an argument. "Maybe Mom has a point," he said. "You're always so busy with work, but I feel like I'm the one keeping everything afloat." The betrayal hit Clara like a gut punch. Brian, the man she had loved and trusted, had allowed his mother's criticisms to poison their marriage. A shocking proposal. One evening, after another tense dinner with Elaine, Brian dropped a bombshell. "Maybe we should take a break," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Mom thinks it could give us some clarity." Clara stared at him, her chest tightening. You want a break because your mom thinks it's a good idea? I just, I think we need to figure things out, Brian stammered. Clara's heart broke, but her resolve hardened. That night, she began making plans, not to fight for Brian, but to fight for herself. Turning the tables. That night, Clara lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Brian's words echoed in her mind. Maybe we should take a break. A part of her wanted to scream, to beg him to see how much his mother was manipulating him. But another part of her, the quiet voice of self-preservation, urged her to stop fighting for someone who wouldn't fight for her. By dawn, Clara had made her decision. She wasn't going to cling to a marriage where she was constantly undervalued. Instead, she would fight for herself. A plan takes shape. The next morning, Clara began taking small, deliberate steps toward independence. She opened a savings account in her name, transferring funds she had quietly set aside over the years. She started browsing apartment listings during her lunch breaks, carefully noting places that fit her budget. At work, Clara threw herself into her projects with renewed focus. Her manager, impressed by her dedication, hinted at a potential promotion. Clara hadn't felt this capable, or free, in months. I need to put myself first, she thought for the first time in a long time. Clara's newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed at home. Brian seemed perplexed by her calm demeanor. He had expected tears, arguments, or at least some acknowledgement of his suggestion to take a break. But Clara didn't fight. She simply moved through the days with quiet determination. Are you okay? Brian asked one evening as they sat in the living room. I'm fine, Clara replied, her tone steady. Brian frowned. You've been distant? Clara raised an eyebrow. I thought that's what you wanted. A break? The silence that followed was thick with tension. For the first time, Brian looked uncertain. Elaine, sensing a shift in dynamics, doubled down on her efforts to maintain control. She began calling Brian more frequently, urging him to make a decision about the marriage. Clara's probably just biding her time, Elaine said during one call. She knows she can't manage without you. But Clara wasn't waiting for Brian to decide. She was preparing to leave, and when the time came, she would be ready. The tipping point came during a dinner at Elaine's house. Clara had decided to attend, knowing it might be one of the last family gatherings she would tolerate. As they sat around the table, Elaine's barbs became more pointed. Clara, dear, Elaine said, her voice dripping with faux concern, have you thought about scaling back at work? Brian tells me you're always so busy. A wife's first priority should be her home, after all. Clara set down her fork, her gaze steady. Thank you for your advice, Elaine, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my career and my home. Elaine's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Well, I just hope you don't forget what's important. Brian, as usual, said nothing, his silence cutting deeper than any of Elaine's words. That night, Clara packed her essentials into a suitcase. She wasn't leaving just yet. She wanted to secure an apartment first, but she needed to see how it felt to take that step. As she zipped the bag closed, she felt a wave of relief. She wasn't trapped. She had options. The next day, she finalized her application for a cozy one-bedroom apartment in the city. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. 2 weeks later, Brian confronted Clara. I feel like you're pulling away, he said, his tone accusatory. Clara looked him in the eye, her expression calm. I'm giving you the space you wanted, Brian. Isn't that what this break is about? Brian hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I just needed time to think. And what have you decided? Clara asked, her voice steady. I think maybe we should separate, Brian said, the words tumbling out awkwardly. Clara nodded. I figured you'd say that, and I agree. Brian blinked, clearly expecting resistance. You do? Yes, Clara said, a small smile playing on her lips. I've already made arrangements to move out. The color drained from Brian's face. What do you mean? I mean, I've been preparing for this, Brian. I'm ready to move forward, with or without you. The day Clara moved out was unceremonious. She loaded the last box into her car, took one final look at the house that had once symbolized hope, and left without looking back. Brian stood in the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and regret. He hadn't expected her to actually go through with it, but Clara was done waiting for him to see her worth. Her new apartment wasn't large, but it was hers. She spent her first night on the couch with a takeout pizza, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the unfamiliar sounds of city life. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. In the weeks that followed, Clara focused on herself. She dove into her work with renewed energy, earning that long-awaited promotion. Her new role came with a significant pay raise and responsibilities she thrived on. She joined a yoga class, something she had always wanted to try but had put off in the chaos of her marriage. The quiet moments on the mat reminded her of the strength she had forgotten she possessed. Her evenings were filled with things that brought her joy, catching up with friends, exploring her neighborhood, and even picking up painting, a hobby she hadn't indulged in since college. Clara's life blossomed in ways she hadn't imagined, and she found herself smiling more often than not. Brian's realization. Meanwhile, Brian's life didn't fare as well. Without Clara around, the house felt cold and empty. He had thought the space would feel like freedom, but instead, it echoed with loneliness. Elaine, who had been so vocal during their marriage, suddenly offered little comfort. Her frequent calls began to irritate him, her advice less helpful and more controlling. "I told you this would happen," Elaine said one evening. "Clara was always too independent. You're better off." But Brian wasn't so sure. As he looked around at the life they had built together, now dismantled, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Brian reached out to Clara a month after she moved out. His text was simple but loaded. "Can we talk?" Clara hesitated before replying. She agreed to meet him, more out of curiosity than anything else. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, the air heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," Brian began, his voice uncertain. "I miss you, Clara. I realize now how much I let my mom interfere. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Brian, I appreciate your apology, but I can't go back to being the woman who constantly has to prove her worth. Not to you, and certainly not to your mother." "I've set boundaries with her," Brian said quickly. "Things can be different." Clara shook her head. "I've already built a life where I don't have to fight to be respected. I'm not giving that up." Brian's shoulders slumped. He knew she was right. Clara left the cafe feeling lighter. She had finally closed the chapter on her marriage, not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity and self-respect. Over the next year, she continued to thrive. Her promotion led to even greater opportunities, and her circle of friends expanded as she embraced her independence. Brian, meanwhile, struggled to navigate a life without Clara. He tried to rebuild, but the weight of his choices lingered. Elaine's influence waned as Brian began to see her for who she truly was, but the damage had already been done. On the anniversary of her move, Clara sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She thought about the woman she had been when she married Brian, hopeful, eager to please, and willing to compromise. Now she was stronger, more self-assured, and unapologetically herself. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't a dramatic showdown or a grand gesture. Sometimes it was simply choosing yourself and walking away. And that's exactly what Clara had done.